was the fall semester of 2022, and the new batch of freshmen had just arrived at St. Michael's University. Among them was Emily, an ambitious, introverted student excited to start her college journey. She had just been assigned to room 108 in Baxter Hall, a building notorious for its eerie atmosphere. Students whispered about it, but Emily didn't believe in such rumors. After all, it was just a dorm. As Emily moved into her dorm room, she noticed something odd. The room had an ancient feel to it, with furniture that seemed out of place, too old for a modern university. The strangest thing was a large, dusty mirror mounted on the wall opposite her bed. Its frame was made of worn wood, and there was something unsettling about its reflection, as though shadows moved within it when no one was around. That first night, Emily woke up to a creaking sound. At first, she thought it was just the old pipes or her roommate moving about. But when she glanced across the room, her roommate, Sarah, was fast asleep. The creaking continued, coming from the mirror. Emily sat up, staring at the reflection. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing behind her, but when she turned around, there was nothing there. The following day, during lunch, Emily brought up the strange occurrence to Sarah, who brushed it off as paranoia. However, a fellow student, Ben, overheard and warned her about room 108. Ben told them about a legend dating back to the 1960s. A student named Elena had lived in the very same room. Elena was a quiet girl, always keeping to herself. One night, she simply disappeared. The university claimed she dropped out, but her friends believed otherwise. They said she had been lured by something in that room and was never seen again. At first, Emily found the story ridiculous, but soon, other students began sharing their own experiences with the dorm. Whispers about strange sightings, nightmares, and students who moved out after just a few weeks filled the cafeteria. Emily and Sarah laughed it off, but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. One night, a week after moving in, things escalated. Emily had fallen into a deep sleep when she began to dream of the room. In her dream, the mirror glowed with a faint, eerie light. As she approached it, she saw Elena's reflection standing inside. Elena's eyes were wide with terror, her hands pressed against the glass, as though she was trapped inside the mirror, begging to be let out. Emily woke up in a cold sweat, only to find the mirror glowing faintly in reality. This time, she knew she wasn't imagining things. She quickly woke Sarah, who also saw the strange light, but suggested they should cover the mirror instead of removing it. They threw a blanket over the mirror and tried to go back to sleep. However, that night was only the beginning. Over the next few days, Emily felt an increasing sense of dread. The room grew colder, and the whispers began. In the middle of the night, Emily would hear faint voices calling her name, and sometimes she'd catch glimpses of Elena's reflection in the covered mirror. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily visited the university archives. There she found an old newspaper article about Elena's disappearance. It mentioned that Elena had been a gifted artist who had a fascination with mirrors, believing they were portals to other worlds. The article also mentioned something disturbing. Elena had drawn dozens of sketches of herself, trapped in various mirrors, all labeled with the phrase, "They watch from the other side." After digging further, Emily found a personal journal entry by one of Elena's old roommates. The journal described how Elena had begun acting strangely in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, speaking of a presence in the room, particularly in the mirror. The last entry was haunting. Elena says she has to go. She says they need her. I'm scared for her. With the truth now clear, Emily realized that the mirror was more than just an antique. It was a gateway to whatever had taken Elena. That night, as she and Sarah prepared to leave the dorm, the mirror's cover fell to the ground on its own. The lights flickered, and the room grew deathly silent. Emily knew they couldn't run anymore. Suddenly, the reflection of the room in the mirror distorted, and the figure of Elena appeared again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Dark, shadowy figures moved behind her, their long, twisted fingers reaching for the surface of the mirror. Elena screamed silently, her face twisted in fear as the shadows pulled her back into the darkness. Emily, unable to move, felt an icy grip on her arm. Turning around, she saw one of the shadowy figures stepping out from the mirror, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Sarah screamed and ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Summoning every bit of courage, Emily grabbed the heavy wooden frame of the mirror and with all her strength, smashed it against the floor. The mirror shattered, sending a wave of cold air through the room. The shadowy figure vanished, and the room fell still once more. After that night, Emily and Sarah moved out of Baxter Hall. The university quietly replaced the mirror, and the incident was never spoken of again. But Emily knew that something dark still lurked in room 108. She left the university at the end of the semester, unable to shake the feeling that Elena's story was far from over. And as for room 108, new students still move in, but every now and then someone claims to hear whispers in the dead of night or to see something strange in the mirror. They say if you stare too long, you might just see Elena, still trapped, still waiting to be freed. Months passed after Emily and Sarah left Baxter Hall. Emily transferred to another university, trying to put the past behind her. But even in her new life, the memories of room 108 clung to her like a shadow. She had nightmares, always the same one. In the dream, she stood before the shattered mirror, but this time, the shards began to reassemble themselves, piece by piece, until the mirror was whole again. The moment it reformed, she would see Elena's terrified face, whispering, "You didn't finish it." One night, the dream became so vivid that Emily woke up with her hands clenched around an old piece of paper. She didn't remember ever picking it up, but it was a sketch of the mirror, exactly as it had been in room 108. At the bottom, written in shaky handwriting, was the phrase, "They are still watching." Back at St. Michael's University, the new academic year began, and Chris, a sophomore, was assigned to room 108. He hadn't heard the stories about Elena or Emily. Baxter Hall was just a dorm to him, but within a week of moving in, he started feeling strange. It wasn't just the cold drafts or the creaky floors. There was a presence in the room, one he couldn't explain. The mirror that Emily had shattered had been replaced, and this new mirror was an exact replica of the original, old, with a heavy wooden frame. Chris didn't think much of it at first, but then the dreams began. Like Emily before him, Chris found himself standing in front of the mirror at night, his reflection distorting, twisting into something unrecognizable. Sometimes he would wake up with bruises on his arms, as though someone or something had grabbed him in his sleep. One night, he awoke to see his reflection in the mirror, but something was wrong. His reflection was smiling, even though Chris knew he wasn't. As he watched in horror, his reflection raised a hand and waved, while Chris stood frozen in his bed, unable to move. Then the reflection mouthed 2 words, "Help me." Back at her new school, Emily received a message from Ben, the student who had warned her about room 108. He told her about Chris and the strange occurrences in the dorm. The moment Emily read his message, a wave of dread washed over her. She knew it wasn't over, Whatever was in that room was still there, still reaching out to claim its next victim, determined to put an end to the haunting once and for all. Emily returned to St. Michael's. She met with Ben and Sarah, both of whom were skeptical about her plan. Emily believed the mirror was the key, but this time, simply breaking it wouldn't be enough. She needed to understand what had trapped Elena, and now Chris, inside. Sarah, who had always been more practical, agreed to help, though she was reluctant to return to Baxter Hall. Together they began researching the history of the mirror. They learned that it wasn't just an antique. It had been part of an ancient occult ritual used to trap spirits and souls in the reflection. Elena, with her obsession with mirrors, had unknowingly triggered the curse, and it had claimed her ever since. Emily, Sarah, and Ben planned to confront the entity once more. They knew they needed to destroy the mirror, but this time they would have to perform a ritual to sever the connection between the spirit world and the physical realm. They gathered what they needed: candles, salt, and a piece of the original shattered mirror that Emily had kept. As they set up the ritual, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, the temperature dropped, and the sound of distant whispers filled the air. Emily could feel the presence closing in on them, as though the shadows themselves were watching, waiting. They lit the candles, creating a circle of salt around the mirror. Emily stood in front of it, holding the shard from the original mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her reflection, it was Elena. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, as if she had been trapped for decades in that dark space. Behind her, the shadowy figures loomed, waiting for their chance to cross over. As Emily began the ritual, reading from the ancient text they had found, the shadows in the mirror became more restless. The room grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. Suddenly the mirror began to shake, as though something was trying to break through. Elena's reflection screamed silently, her hands pressed against the glass, just like in Emily's earlier dreams. The final moments of the ritual were the most intense. The room seemed to vibrate with dark energy, and the shadows in the mirror began to seep out into the real world. Chris appeared at the doorway, his eyes vacant, as though he were being controlled by the entity within the mirror. Emily had to make a choice: destroy the mirror and risk trapping Elena forever, or complete the ritual and hope to free both her and Chris. As the shadows drew closer, threatening to consume them all, Emily held up the shard of the original mirror and pressed it against the new one. With one final chant, she drove the shard into the glass. The mirror shattered, but this time, it didn't just break. It disintegrated, the fragments dissolving into dust. The shadows let out a deafening scream, and then, in an instant, the room fell silent. Chris collapsed to the floor, unconscious but alive. Elena's reflection was gone, and for the first time, the mirror's surface was nothing but empty glass. In the aftermath, Emily and her friends left Baxter Hall for good. The room was finally at peace, and whatever had haunted it was gone. Chris, though shaken, had no memory of what had happened to him during his time in the dorm. Elena, it seemed, had finally found her release. But Emily knew that there had been a price. She could feel it in the back of her mind, a lingering presence, a whisper of something unfinished. The mirror was gone, but the entity behind it had not been fully destroyed. It had been weakened, driven back, but Emily knew that one day it might return, seeking another soul to claim. As she walked away from St. Michael's for the last time, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow watching her from the windows of Baxter Hall. But the windows were dark and empty, for now. Emily had hoped that after the ritual, The nightmares would finally end. Yet months after leaving St. Michael's, the eerie silence in her new life began to unravel. It started small, glimpses of movement in the corner of her eye, her reflection seeming slower to respond in mirrors, and shadows lingering just a moment too long. At first, she thought it was paranoia, the trauma of what she had been through. But deep down, Emily knew. The entity had not been fully vanquished. One night, as she was brushing her teeth, she noticed something odd. The mirror in her new apartment seemed to distort slightly, as though a ripple had passed through the glass. Leaning closer, she saw it again, a faint outline of Elena's face in the background. Her heart raced as the reflection whispered something she couldn't quite hear. Panic surged through her as she run from the bathroom, slamming the door behind her. The next morning, the bathroom mirror was perfectly normal, no sign of Elena or any shadowy presence. But the experience left her shaken. The entity was still with her, still watching. Desperate for answers, Emily reached out to Ben. He had continued his research into Baxter Hall and the entity after their ritual, hoping to uncover more about what they had encountered. What they discovered was chilling. The entity they had faced was part of an ancient order of watchers, malevolent spirits bound to mirrors and reflective surfaces. These watchers were cursed souls, trapped in limbo, and they could only break free by claiming new souls to take their place. Ben explained that their ritual had disrupted the Watchers' hold over Baxter Hall, but it had not destroyed them. Instead, they had scattered, waiting for a new opportunity to latch on to those who had summoned them. Emily had been the primary focus of their attention, and now they were following her. Ben proposed a solution, a second, more powerful ritual to sever the Watcher's connection to Emily. But this ritual would be far more dangerous. It required luring the Watchers into a final confrontation where they would be trapped and banished for good. The key was finding the original mirror shard that Emily had used during the first ritual. While Emily and Ben prepared for the new ritual, strange things began happening to Sarah. After leaving St. Michael's, she had moved on with her life, putting the horrors of room 108 behind her, or so she thought. One evening, Sarah was walking home when she passed a store with a large antique mirror displayed in the window. As she glanced at her reflection, something terrifying caught her eye. Elena was there, staring back at her with that same hollow gaze. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. When she blinked, the reflection was gone. Shaken, Sarah tried to brush it off as stress or exhaustion. But over the next few days, the sightings grew worse. She saw Elena's face in puddles of water, in glass windows, even in the reflection of her phone screen. It was as if the Watchers were closing in on her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Finally, one night, Sarah woke to a feeling of suffocation. Her room was filled with shadows that moved unnaturally, curling and twisting around her. She gasped for air as the dark figures closed in, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. In the mirror across from her bed, she saw Elena's reflection, her mouth open in a silent scream. Sarah managed to escape the room, but she knew she couldn't outrun the Watchers forever. Terrified, she contacted Emily, confessing that the Watchers had found her too. Emily, now fully aware of the danger they were all in, insisted that Sarah join them for the final ritual. Emily, Ben, and Sarah met in an old abandoned building that Ben had secured for the ritual. It was far from any reflective surfaces, which they hoped would give them some advantage over the Watchers. The air was thick with tension, and even though they had gathered everything they needed for the ritual, candles, salt, and the mirror shard, there was no guarantee it would work. As they set up the ritual circle, Emily felt the familiar sense of dread creeping up her spine. The Watchers were near. The temperature dropped, and the room filled with an eerie silence, as if the world had paused in anticipation. The three of them stood inside the salt circle, their breaths visible in the cold air. It began slowly. The shadows in the room grew darker, pooling in the corners and creeping toward them. In the center of the room, a figure materialized, Elena. But this time, she was no longer the terrified girl trapped in the mirror. Her eyes were black voids, and her movements were slow and deliberate, like something from a nightmare. Ben started chanting the ritual incantation, his voice steady but strained. The shadows around them pulsed with dark energy as the Watchers gathered, their hollow eyes fixed on the three in the circle. Elena's figure stepped closer, her hand reaching out toward Emily. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, like reality itself was warping. Suddenly the Watchers lunged at the circle. Their dark, elongated arms stretched toward Emily and Sarah, but they couldn't break the barrier of salt. Ben's chanting grew louder, more urgent, and the Watchers began to writhe in pain, their forms flickering in and out of existence. Just as they seemed on the verge of being banished, one of the shadows grabbed Ben from behind, pulling him out of the circle. His voice faltered, and the ritual wavered. The circle began to break as the shadows surged forward, overwhelming them. Sarah screamed as one of the Watchers wrapped its cold fingers around her neck, dragging her toward the mirror shard. Emily had one chance. She grabbed the shard, and with all her strength, thrust it into the ground, smashing it into pieces. A deafening roar filled the room as the Watchers recoiled, their dark forms disintegrating into the air. Elena's figure vanished, her hollow eyes filled with a moment of peace before she faded away. When the shadows finally dissipated, the room was still. Ben lay unconscious, but alive. Sarah, though shaken, had survived as well. Emily stood over the shattered remains of the mirror shard, knowing that the Watchers had been banished for good this time. The air felt lighter, as though the weight of the entity had been lifted. As they left the building, Emily couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. The Watchers were gone, but at what cost? She had seen too much, felt too deeply the pull of their world. And though the mirrors no longer held Elena's reflection, Emily knew that the Watchers had left their mark on her soul. Months passed, and life seemed to return to normal. Ben recovered, and Sarah moved far away, vowing never to speak of the events again. But for Emily, the peace was short-lived. Every so often, she would catch a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, a shadow that didn't belong, a face that wasn't hers in the reflection. One evening, as she stared into her bathroom mirror, Emily saw it, a pair of dark, hollow eyes watching her from the glass. She blinked, and the image was gone. But the feeling remained. The Watchers were still out there, waiting, watching, and Emily knew that someday they would return.